Greetings. So, how many games have I got in my collection? I've been pondering this question for some time, but recently, having collected all that I want to of retro style games, I felt it was a good time to try and find out how many games I'd collected over the years and how many was in the current collection. Obviously it will increase in the future when new stuff comes out, but at the same time I might sell something as well, so it's probably not going to go up and down a great deal from where it is now. So that's prompted why I wanted to find out how many games were in the collection, which is what I was alluding to in my previous video when I was talking about the PlayStation range of consoles and how many games I'd got for Sony consoles. And my initial thought was I was going to do a few videos, each for different style systems, and eventually end up with a grand total of what games I'd got in the collection. Hadn't got the patience, so I've just counted everything up, and I'm now going to sum it all up in one video. So I'm not going to mess about. We'll crack straight on with it. So as I previously said in the Sony video, I'd already given totals for those, so it has changed slightly because since I've recorded that I have bought another couple of PS5 games, and I also found 4 PS4 games that I didn't include when I made the list to start with because they were in a different place, the ones in those the Capcom generations in the books. I forgot to count those, so there are slight amendments. So PS1 games, we've got a total of 147 games, and I should say before I go any further, these totals are all genuine games. There's no repros included. They're all genuine, majority boxed up complete, but there are a few cart onlys which I've included in the totals. So yes, PS1 we've got 147 games. PS2 we've got 142 games, remarkably similar, which is a theme, I've got to say. PS3 games I've got 86, and that's more than I thought I'd got, to be honest. I thought that would be one of my smaller collections. PS4 we've got 104 games, and then PS5 we've got 50 games, giving me a grand total of 529 PlayStation games across the 5 consoles. Which prompted me to sort of declare myself a bit of a Sony pony, having never really thought of myself as one before, purely because of the amount of games I seem to have for Sony consoles. It kind of surprised me. So we'll see where that ends up. Moving on then, I looked at Sega consoles next. I've always been a Sega head, always will be. It will always be my number one sort of game manufacturer, publisher, whatever you want to call it, purely for the arcade races, because I love Sega arcade races. However, Sega being pretty much dead in the console world for the past 25 years, there's so much water gone under the bridge, and there's many more generations of, say, Sony consoles since, which gives them a kind of unfair advantage, I suppose, because there's much more to collect for. So on that basis, I wasn't expecting my Sega collection to be anything like some of the others, purely because it sort of ceased 25 years ago, if you like, and it's not current anymore. So anyway, Sega console wise, we've got just one Game Gear game, and we've got one Sega Mark III game. Outrun, obviously, on both. Then on the Master System, now I grew up on a Master System, but I grew up a decent collection of Master System, but I decided at some point to sell off the majority, and I kept what I hadn't played as a child, and that's what I've now got. And we've got 27 Master System games in the collection. They are all complete in box, I believe. I think I'm missing a manual, actually. Beside the point, we're just talking about games in the collection. Now, Mega Drive, I thought I'd got a few Mega Drive games in the collection. And it's, you know, most of these span like Japanese, American and sort of European releases. I've just bundled them all into one for ease, and else this video will go on for months. So, in the collection I've got 111 Mega Drive games, and I've also included 32X in that as well. Because it's kind of a Mega Drive, isn't it, if you follow me. So, yeah, 111 Mega Drive and 32X games. So that then brings us on to the Mega CD. Now, I've only got 5 games on the Mega CD, like genuine games. All my others are repros, which I'm not counting in this list. I've never been a fan of the Mega CD, if I'm honest, hence why I've only got 5 games for it. So that's a relatively small number. Then, of course, we move on to the Saturn. Now, again, all these collections, I've had more than this, and I've trimmed them all down over time. I've had more Saturn, I've trimmed them back. I currently have 104 Saturn games in the collection. I certainly don't see that going up, only down if I decide to sell any off. We then come on to the last of the Sega consoles, obviously being the Dreamcast. And again, I thought I'd got a few of these. It turns out I've got 85 Dreamcast games, again across all Japanese, American and PAL formats. So, overall, that gives me a total of 334 games for Sega consoles. Which, I don't know whether I was expecting more than that, to be honest. I have had more in the past, because I've sold off quite a lot of Master System and some Saturn. So, you know, I've just left myself with the quality ones I want to play, really. So yeah, 334 games for Sega consoles. Right, that then brings me on to Xbox consoles. Now, I've never really been an Xbox guy, although I've had the original Xbox and the 360 from launch. The Xbox One I've only ever got in more recent times, and I've never had and never wanted whatever the current one's called. So, original Xbox games, I've got 64 of those. And again, I certainly can't see that growing, only reducing. But like I say, I've pretty much reduced down to what I'm happy with on all these consoles anyway. So 64 original Xbox games, and then 360. I've got 77 of those, and to be honest, I've gained quite a few of those, like I did for the PS3, for the driving rig in the arcade. So my collection of 360 was smaller up until setting up a driving rig. But anyway, we're now at 77 360 games. And again, certainly not going to grow. That then brings us to the Xbox One, again, which is only for use in the arcade, more or less. Though I do have one in here, which I can use if I want to. But majority of this collection was for races on the driving cab. And I've got 60 Xbox One games. So that then gives me a total across all Xbox consoles. I've got 201 Xbox games of all denominations. So quite a bit smaller than the Sega and the Sony, really. That then brings us on to Nintendo. Now obviously Nintendo have been going and spanning the most amount of years, because they've been going right from the dawn of time, and they're still current to this day. So you would kind of expect that this probably is the heaviest part of the collection. So we'll start with the earliest. Obviously we've got the NES. Now I've got 29 NES American cards, but the bulk of my collection is Famicom, and I've got 141 Famicom games, so a hefty chunk there. So overall, including the NES and the Famicom, we've got 170, because it's all the same console really. That then brings us on to the Super Nintendo. Again, I thought I'd got quite a few for this, and I've actually got 97 games for the SNES, so reasonable amount, I'd say. More than enough for me anyway. We then come on to the N64, and again, I've had quite a big collection of N64. When I first got my RGB console modded, or my console modded to be RGB, I went quite deep down that hole, but I ended up selling them all again anyway. And I'm back to 30 for the N64, and they are all complete in box Japanese. Again, definitely not going to grow. I'm not a huge fan of the N64 for obvious reasons, though the RGB one makes it a hell of a lot better, and the first party games generally are tremendous. We then come on to the GameCube, and again, I like the GameCube, but I've never been sort of crazy about buying games for it. I've never had a big collection for the GameCube, and mine spans both American and Japanese, and I've got 43 games for the GameCube, so a fairly modest amount really. We then come on to the Wii. Now I did have quite a lot of Wii games at one point, but because they were 10 a penny, weren't they? And I thought, I'll buy a few up. Who knows, one day they might be valuable. As of yet, they're not. So I decided to get rid of a load because they were just in my way. And I've now sort of pared the collection back quite substantially. And we've got, and even the ones I've got, to be honest, I've separated them here into two amounts. We've got 38 of them, which, to be honest, I've got no interest in really, but they're absolutely worthless. So, I'm not going to throw them away, but they're not worth selling because they're worth nothing. And they're the kind of games which are alright, like Christmas or, party games, that kind of rubbish. So anyway, I've got 38 of those in the collection. But the collection I've kept, if you like, I've got 74 of those for the Wii. So it gives me a grand total of 112 games for the Wii. There's some good stuff on the Wii. Wii's a good console. It gets a bad rep through all the crap on it. But it's a good console. Right, that brings us on to the Wii U. Again, obviously, if you've been watching this channel for a while, I had a full set of Wii U. But I soon realised the error of my stupidity, and I got rid of it. I enjoyed collecting a full set. I get the bug for it. I understand anybody who wants to do it. In some ways, it's full set collecting is, it's addictive. I get it. But I soon, like I say, realised my stupidity, and full set collecting is crazy. I would never ever do it again. It's bonkers. You just end up with loads of crap you've got no interest in playing. So what the hell have you bought it for? I don't get, I get it, but I don't get it, if you know what I mean. Anyway, we've now pared it back to what I consider worth owning on the Wii U, and we've got 20 games. which is more than enough. You know, it's a great console, I like it a lot, but there isn't much on it to recommend it, especially nowadays with mouse being ported to the Switch. So, 20 games for the Wii U. That then brings us on to the Switch. Again, I thought I'd got a few Switch games, because the Switch is such an amazing console. I mean, it's full of so many sort of games that hark back to the past and the, you know, what you might consider the golden age. And you know, there's loads of retro inspired stuff and there's loads of cool stuff on the Switch. It's an amazing console. I've bought so much for it, but there's so much of it I haven't played. You know, I've got loads of it still sealed. You know, that's the trouble with collecting, isn't it? You know, we need more time to play this stuff. That's my plan going forwards. However, I've got 95 games for the Switch. I've possibly had more over time, but again, sometimes when I get sort of in need of cash, it's easy to cash Switch games in, and I have sold some in the past to raise funds. But as it stands at the moment, I've got 95 Switch games. Then obviously the current console is the Switch 2. I've only got 2 games for that, because I've got Mario Kart built in, so I'm not counting that. I would like the physical one, but until I've got it, I'm not counting it as an actual game, even though, you know, I've played through it and, you know, it's brilliant. So yeah, we've got 2 games physically for the Switch 2. So that gives me a grand total across all Nintendo consoles of 569 games, which, I don't know, I was kind of expecting it might be more than that, if I'm honest. So that kind of surprised me. Right, so then we move on to Atari. Fairly small collection. 2600 mainly. And I only got into that sort of when the 2600 Plus came out. Prior to that, I hadn't got any Atari in the collection, although I've had it and sold it over the years. So anyway, now being a big fan of the Atari 2600 VCS, I've got 102 2600 games in the collection. Who knows, that might grow a bit, I don't know. I'm not ruling it out. We've then got 2 5200 games. I know, don't ask. And then we've got 5 7800 games. Again, very modest collection. I'm not a fan of the 7800 as a console, to be honest, but there are a few decent games on it, hence why I've only got 5. And then lastly, we've got the Jaguar. Again, another much maligned console, but I do have a soft spot for it. I really do quite like the Jag. I've got 12 games for that. Again, there's a lot of rubbish on the Jag, so I think the 12 games I've got are all the games I'd ever want to own for it, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, which are too expensive to find. So anyway, that gives me a grand total of 121 Atari games, which isn't a great deal, really. So we're getting towards the end now. We're now moving on to what I'm calling the rest of section, which is all the consoles which are pretty much one-offs, and that they don't sort of have a long history and series of consoles of different generations. So, starting off, we've got the Vectrex. I've got 14 games for the Vectrex. That's pretty much all of the sort of original releases that I want. The homebrew scene is good for the Vectrex, so that could possibly go higher in the future. But as it stands, I've got 14 Vectrex games. In television next. Now again, I don't see this collection growing, if I'm honest. I've got 18 games for the Intellivision. I've pretty much got all the decent games I want for it, which are affordable. there's a couple which are like silly money, and I just wouldn't pay it for Intellivision games. So I've got 18 games for that. We then come on to the ColecoVision, fantastic console. I've got 31 games for the ColecoVision. There is possibility for that to increase, but I wouldn't imagine buying many at all. In a similar mould, we've got the video pack, a bit older. Again, I don't see this changing. I've got 20 games for the video pack. You know, quite an early and quite primitive console, but there's some really good games on it. But we've got 20. That then brings me on to the 3DO. So we've jumped forward quite a bit now, really. It was massive at the time. Unless you experienced it at the time, it's hard to sort of explain how impressive and how groundbreaking the 3DO was. It was just very, very short-lived. And I've had quite a decent collection for the 3DO over the years, but again, I've pared this back now to pretty much the best games that I'm interested in playing on it. And I've got 20 games for the 3DO. That then brings me on to the Neo Geo, the king of consoles. First of all, we've got the AES, which is my system of choice. Unfortunately, I've had a much larger collection in the past, but the price of them nowadays, it makes it impossible for me to collect. I just can't justify or afford them. So I've pretty much got the original games I had back in the day when I had one, you know, when they were new. And I've got 13 AES games. We've also then got a Neo Geo CD. And I've got 21 games for that, although I've got a lot more but repro. I've got 21 original games. I mean, fantastic console, but even that now is gone really quite expensive. I mean, it's not as bad as AES, but you know, CD is not the cheap option anymore, unfortunately. However, we've got 21 of those. Right, we've then got the Evercade, much maligned, but malign it at your peril, in my opinion. The Evercade is a fantastic console, especially if you like arcade games. It's a magnificent arcade powerhouse. And we've got 40 games for the Evercade. Funnily enough, we've got 20 sort of non-arcade and 20 arcade. I've got all the arcade ones. Just, you know, a weird curiosity. I've got 40 and it's a 20-20 split. Right, we're then going back a bit in time, right to my first foray into gaming, and we've got the Spectrum. Now again, I've had quite a substantial Spectrum collection over the years, but again, I've pared this right back pretty much to the games I had and played back in the day when I was a kid. You know, haven't got the space to store it, so plus with the, you know, the emulation on the Spectrum Next, no, not the Next, the Spectrum, I don't need to load up original games. So anyway, I've now got 62 games for the Spectrum, which is more than enough, to be honest. I'm never going to load them up, I don't think, now I've got the Spectrum. It's far easier, and that's my convenient way now to play the Spectrum games. However, I couldn't sell my originals, you know, that I had back in the day. You know, it's kind of nice to have them to look at and enjoy when I want to. Right, we've then got the PC Engine. Again, there's a familiar theme here. I've had a much larger PC Engine collection over the years, but at some point I sold all my PC Engine, and it's one of those things that I've bought one back, and I've gradually bought a few games, but now they're at such a price level, I can't justify buying them, especially, to be honest, when I've got the EverDrive. I can't justify paying the prices they go for. So I've now got 44 Hue cards for the PC Engine, and I've got 13 CD games for the Duo, or PC Engine CD, or whatever you want to call it. Again, I do have more for the CD on repro, but I'm not counting those here. So, on all these sort of one-off style consoles, we've got a total of 296 games. So not that many really. That's kind of how my collecting is really. I don't want loads for anything particularly. I just want stuff that I'm interested in, and that's enough for me on any console, to be honest. Even though I've got a lot of consoles probably, I haven't got massive collections for anything. Personally, I don't think. The people with miles more than I've got. Right, that brings me on to the last section, which is handhelds. Never been a handheld gamer really, even though I've had them all from launch whenever they've come out, more or less. I've never had a WonderSwan. You know, I've had a Lynx and sold it. I've had a Game Gear and sold it. You know, I had them all sort of new at the time, all except the WonderSwan. But nowadays, like I say, I've never been mad into handhelds, and so consequently, I haven't got much now. Game Boy games, we've got 5. That's all. Game Boy Advance games, we've only got 1. And I've only got that really because my nephew found it years and years ago when he was a little kid. He found it in a field at school. It was filthy, filthy dirty. Disgusting looking thing, but I cleaned it up and it worked. So I've always kept it ever since. It's kind of nice memories. So 1 Game Boy Advance game. We then move on to the DS. Again, we've got 24 games for the DS, so a very small collection. I rarely ever play it, but it's nice to have the few that I do like, you know, should I ever want to play them. Much the same for the 3DS. I mean, it's a fantastic console, the 3DS, I've got to say, but I just don't handheld game very often. We've got 25 games for the 3DS, so remarkably similar to the DS. Then last of all, we've got the PSP, which I suppose I could have included with the Sony consoles, but, and the same for the Nintendo with the Game Boy and DS, but never mind, we've put them all together with handhelds. We've got 59 PSP games. So across all my handheld consoles, I've got 114 games, which are, you know, quite a small part of the collection, like I say. And having worked all this out, I have found it quite interesting to find how some totals are quite similar to others. Like, I've got 148 PS1 and 142 PS2, you know, very, very similar. And then I've got 77 Xbox 360 games, and I've got 86 PS3 games. Again, very, very similar. I don't know. That wasn't in no way planned, but it's quite curious how I've ended up with a very similar amount for same sort of era consoles there, and same kind of amounts for PS1 and then PS2. I don't know. And I suppose PS4 isn't a million miles away from PS1 and 2 with 142, 148 and 142. So, you know, I don't think, you know, some things don't compare, but others do. I mean, it's total irrelevant. It's all sort of, not pot luck, but it's just what appeals to me. Anyway, with all that said, what is the total number for games in my collection? You might want to know. You may have just skipped forward to this bit, I don't know. But anyway, we'll just run through the totals once more and then we'll do the grand total. So, on the Sony consoles, these are all home consoles. We'll do the handhelds at the end. So, on all the Sony consoles, I own 530 games. On all the Sega consoles, I own 334 games. On all the Xbox consoles, I own 201 games. On all the Nintendo consoles, I own 569 games. On Atari consoles, I own 121 games. On all the rest of the one-off style consoles, I own 296 games. And then on handhelds, I own 114 games. So, although I am quite a Sony pony as it turns out, with 530 games, the actual winner in the collection with most games is Nintendo. And then Sony is in second place. And then in third place, even though they haven't made a console for 25 years, is Sega with 334. So, what is the grand total? I hear you scream. Well, I'm delighted now to have found out the grand total of games in my console collection. And it is 2,164 games. And that constitutes the collection. What's in your collection? I'm glad to have found that out. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thank you very much for watching. Be seeing you.